All right, so hopefully this magically comes on as soon as I start talking. Welcome to this evening's event put on by International Alert. My name's Dan Smith, I'm Secretary General of International Alert. And we're here this evening for a conversation that I recognize several faces amongst you. And so I know that you know the way that we do this. We're going to have a conversation. There's no lectures. There's no PowerPoint, so there's no death by that or any other means. We've got 4 people I'll tell you about in a moment to start that conversation, and then as it rolls on, then I want to bring you in with comments and questions that you have to make. And of course, what brings us here this evening is launching this report, Peace Through Prosperity. I have one of the full versions. You've all been given the executive summary to take away. But do try to get hold of the full version as well. I don't think you really have to pay very much in blood and love and promises of loyalty and commitment forever in order to get one. Talk to the comms team people who are around and who are out at the desk, or else just go online and get the PDF. So, look, the issue I think is a fairly straightforward one, with which in a lot of ways we're very familiar with. Everybody wants peace and everybody wants prosperity. And you can't really get a whole lot of peace without prosperity, and you can't get a whole lot of prosperity without peace. And foolish arguments about which comes first and which is the more important, put that all to one side. Look, there is a question, there is an issue. Is it possible to build prosperity in a way that builds peace? And that's the question that we want to go in for. Because we know perfectly well that you can have economic growth in countries and also have instability, fragility, armed conflict, atrocity in them. You have a nice prosperous corner down in one part of the country and a horrible marginalized and conflict-torn area up in another part of the country. So we know that the link between prosperity and peace, or between development and peace, is not automatic. So how do you make it real, since it seems so obvious that it should be available? And to help us with this discussion this evening, to kick it off, I'm going to turn to Phil Vernon, who's sitting in the middle here, who's the Director of Programs at International Alert and is the author of this report, which brings you here this evening. Sitting on his right next to me is Juliet Wattebot, who's conflict advisor in the private sector department at DFID. So bringing together these two issues, the peace and the prosperity issue in one. Sitting next along from Phil is Ramani Kunanayagam. I've been practicing trying to get the distribution of emphasis on those syllables for days, and I think I came fairly close, about a 6.5, 7 out of 10 for that one. Who is Group Head of Social Performance at the BG Group. And along at the end, sort of sitting opposite me, is Lanre Akinola, who's he's unemployed. But you're going to see why, if you have any sense, you should be employing him for some fine thing. Lanre has worked with the Financial Times, the founder and former editor of This Is Africa. He's worked with the Bloomberg Media Initiative in Africa for a while. But at the moment, he's...
It's complicated at the moment.
Freelance.
At the moment, he's resting. So, the only technical thing which I want to say to remind you all is about mobile phones. Do please turn them to silent. That applies to the panelists as well. So, Phil, starting with you, starting right in.
Yeah.
Here's the report. We know what the topic is. We know we're trying to build these linkages. 3 or so headline points, main themes out of the report to get us going.
So 3 main headline out of the report. I would say the first one is, building on what you said at the beginning, Dan, don't need to say it, but I'll say it anyway, conflict remains a really important factor. There's plenty of evidence to show that things have got better over the long duration and even more recently. But there's plenty of evidence around to show that far too many people, 1.5 billion people actually are living in fragile, conflict-affected contexts around the world. That is 1.5 billion too many. So it's a huge issue. Now, I'm a peace builder, so for me it's quite clear that peace building is critical. We need to help these people living in conflict areas to live more peacefully. But actually, the truth is I need to recognize that most people see economy as more important than peace, apart from time to time. You know, my mum thinks the economy is more important than peace because she wants her children and grandchildren to have jobs. Governments are elected for the economy, or unelected governments also care about the economy because that's one way or another how they stay in power. Businesses obviously are interested in the economy. I think if you even go back at the root of the word economy, I think it means knowledge about life, you know, study of life. So the economy is more important most of the time than peace building. So I think the number one thing I would say is it behooves us as people interested in peace and peace building to find ways to infiltrate economic promotion and development, or better still, perhaps get those promoting a business and economic development to integrate the idea of the intent and the knowledge about how to build peace as part of their work into what they're doing. And that was the sort of thing we set out to look at in the report. And I thought, so this is very much in the zeitgeist at the moment. So there's lots of stuff being said and written about this, but we weren't actually able to find a sort of practical framework through which would help those people I've just been talking about to more easily integrate peace building. Because we peace builders like to complicate things, and actually to help other people who are actually focused on bottom lines or infrastructure development or whatever to integrate peace building, we need to actually simplify them a little bit. So that's number one. So couldn't find the framework. So we developed a framework, and I do not claim it is the framework. It's in the report, and I'm happy to have it criticised and people to find ways to do it better or say they would have done it better. But what I did find really interesting about this process is that we set out to try and identify 4 outcomes that we could ask economic development promoters, business people as well, to aim for, as well as the things they were aiming for already as part of their existing policy or project or business. And what we came up with was 4 really familiar sounding ones. And Lanre was saying to me before, this is kind of so obvious that do we even need to say it? Although I know he knows that it's important to say. One is the importance of jobs and decent livelihoods. You know, and I emphasize the decent livelihoods. A second one is the ability of people to safely make savings and invest. Now, jobs is an obvious one. Savings and investments not so obvious for non-peace builders, perhaps, because the importance of savings is that if I've got savings, I've got a stake in stability. That's helpful in a situation where I might be manipulated into violence or conflict. But secondly, I've got a cushion. So I can protect myself from having to just cope. I've got a cushion of savings and investment to help me remain empowered. The third one is revenue taxation and the useful use of taxes to build peace and revenues to build peace by governments. And fourth one, sustainability. And we talked about environmental and social sustainability. So what we're saying is that economic development promoters, if they drive in their programs and projects towards as many of these 4 as possible, but understand the nuances of them. This is not just jobs, any jobs. It's decent jobs and jobs which are broadly available to people from different parts of a country, different ethnicities, different language groups, different gender groups, etc. So that my ability to participate in the economy is not constrained by an identity issue or something like that. And so on and so forth through the others. I won't go in a great deal more detail. We said, how can economic promoters and business people do this? And we then identified 7 things which I've called in the report levers of change. There are 7 areas which economic development promoters and business people tend to have to focus on anyway. So we wanted to look at where people are applying their efforts anyway. How could they use these efforts to promote improvements in the 4 outcomes I mentioned? And I never remember all of them, so I'll just read them out. Those are about the makeup of the economy. So sort of what are the different sectors? How much value add is there in the economy? How deep is it? How much import-export is there? How much is it peasant? How much is it commercial farming, etc., etc.? One is human capital, the importance of human capital and building that. The importance of relationships within society. Great importance in commerce, of course. The rule of law. Businesses are always interested in legal issues or have to be. Security. All businesses have to think about security. Infrastructure, critical for economic development. And, of course, land and capital more broadly. So we saw these as being sort of areas in which business investors and other economic promoters have to get involved. And can I just give a couple of examples there? I mean, there's quite a few examples in the report, but I think one example I thought of mentioning is, so Rwanda, Now, I know that Rwanda is not yet successfully peaceful, but it's making steps and trying to get there, we think. And so Rwanda, I think the Rwandan government looked in the 90s at the economy of the country, and amongst other things, they saw that part of the pressure which led to the genocide in 1994 and had led to earlier episodes was the paucity of the economy and economic choices and the over-dependence of people on very poor soils, high demographic pressure on very poor soils. So very boldly, in my view, they said we need to look for something beyond agriculture, and they opted for IT. Now, that's pretty bold in Rwanda. They're working at it. They're making some steps. They were doing that for economic prosperity reasons, but also to reduce the pressure which had led on society, which had led to the genocide. So there's a sort of a peace-building outcome and an economic outcome being intended at the same time. I'll move on at this point because I don't want to monopolise the time. You've asked the three things. The third thing I would mention, and then I'll stop now, is the political economy, the more complex part of it. So yes, 7 levers of change. Yes, let's drive towards these 4 outcomes. But what's possible in a given political environment or political economy is defined by the factors in the political economy. We helpfully took some DFID work on this. Probably you've moved on from this now, but we found it very useful. And so DFID's done some good work consolidating other scholarship on this. And what they've said, and I think it's absolutely right, is when one wants to look at what's possible in the political economy, one needs to look at 4 factors, really. People's interests, and of course, the more powerful people's interests more than other people's interests. The incentives which act on those interests, what will persuade people to do this or not do this. Then those are mediated by values. Their values, of course, people see their interests not just in terms of economy, but also what they believe is right for cultural reasons or other reasons. And then the fourth and perhaps most important is the institutions through which people mediate these incentives and interests and through which changes happen. And now, a lot of discussions we had when I was writing the report on International Alert about whether one can aspire to change the political economy, because clearly the political economy is never perfect. In the UK, it's not perfect because we're over-dependent on banks. We keep being told that. All the voters in the UK want us to become less dependent on banks, but they vote for governments which want to tax the banks to pay for infrastructure and streetlights and schools. So we're stuck. So even in the UK, which has a fairly mobile political economy, we're sort of stuck in this ever so slightly sclerotic political economy, and that's even more the case in sort of less mature democratic environments. And so I came in the end, I think, to say in the report that to try and change the political economy is actually a fool's errand. One should probably want it to be better and have an idea of how what one's doing might contribute to making it better, but that's probably going to take quite a long time, and this one is Ataturk. And even he may not have changed it as much as history says. So I think it's more about understanding what is possible and not possible in the political economy. And one quick example of that, if I could, which I found fascinating in the reading I did for this report. So what I learned in this report, amongst other things, is that when Saudi Arabia had a ban on importing livestock from Somalia, from the Somalis, let's say, piracy went up. And when they rescinded the ban, piracy went down. So it's not my research, I just read this. So what the researchers found is that in the political economy of these coastal parts of Somaliland and Somalia, the clan system, the institution, is taxing economic activity. And when there is no legal export of livestock to Saudi Arabia, which they can control and tax, I use tax in the broadest sense, they need to look for some other economic activity which they can tax, and that's piracy. So there you have, there's an amazing policy lever there, available in Riyadh for improving peace in Somalia. So that's the way in which I think these things are interrelated. Those are the 3 things, and I probably talked too much.
So one thing I want to just pick up, and in a way it comes out of you saying probably trying to change the political economy is a fool's errand. Changes may unfold over time as a result of what you do, but basically you use a lens of understanding the political economy to recognize what's possible and combine that with what's desirable. And the question which that prompted in my mind as I was listening to you is, how much of this whole enterprise that we're talking about needs to be conscious? I mean, to what extent do those who are building prosperity, if they're going to thereby also build peace, need to intend to be building peace? And to what extent, who's allowed to have the intention, and who's allowed to be carefree and just make a whole lot of money?
Well, who's allowed to be carefree? Lanre, perhaps. No, I think no one is allowed to be carefree. Right. I think, look, there's a responsibility issue here. I'm an actor of some kind in Tunisia, let's say, right now. No matter who I am, actor in, not in the play sense. I'm an entity or a person in Tunisia, in the economy in Tunisia. I must have some responsibility vis-à-vis the problems that Tunisia is now facing. And so, therefore, amongst my intentions, I must have an intention of adding some sort of social value in some way in the circumstance I'm in, I would say. I think it's a sort of a no-brainer that if there's a responsibility, there has to be an intention. Mm-hmm. So I would say the answer to your question is absolutely there has to be an intention. Mm-hmm. And there's a very practical reason for that as well, which is that even more than economic development, which of course is fraught with risk, that's the whole point, peacebuilding is fraught with risk to the power of fraught with risk. So one's got to be very, very clear, at least in one's mind, about what one is intending to contribute. Mm-hmm. Hence the 4 outcomes. You know, if I've got some sort of business if I'm a tourist operator in Tunisia, what's my responsibility? Yes, I've got a responsibility first and foremost to my clients, their safety, but I must have a responsibility to the society in which I'm operating as well. So I've got some choices to make there. And so whatever I decide to do, it must be intentional as far as possible, because I'll probably get it partly wrong. Right. And knowing what I'm trying to achieve allows me to track whether I'm achieving it and therefore adjust.
Okay, Juliet, can I come to you? Your Secretary of State, Justine Greening, Secretary of State for DFID, has made another speech in the last couple of weeks, probably more since that I haven't read, extolling the virtues of private sector as a force for development in poor countries, and also in the same speech emphasizing the importance that DFID is working in fragile and conflict-affected states which are unstable, where there is either violent conflict going on, or there was recently, or there's a high risk of it. And I think, you know, one part of our experience in the peacebuilding field would be how difficult it has been at times to feel that these two areas are connected and are not siloed. So, you know, sort of easy question, in DFID policy and DFID approach, are these two areas properly linked up? And tougher question, so what is DFID doing that shows that they're properly linked up?
Great questions. This is a work in progress for us, I would say. Fragile states has been high on our agenda for a longer time than economic development has. And about the last 2 years or so, we've been thinking about what does this mean for when you bring these agendas together, and a strong recognition that the private sector and economic development more generally has a very big role to play in fragile states in creating jobs and livelihoods and growth. So this is a bit of work in progress, so I'm going to tell you where we're at. So we looked across our programmes to see what we were doing on economic development in fragile states, and I think this probably speaks to what a lot of other development agencies are doing and where they're at. And we found that actually we spend a lot of money and we do a lot of work on economic development in fragile states. About on a scale of 3 to 1, our spend in fragile states as opposed to non-fragile states. Obviously, we're skewed slightly in favour of fragile states because 21 of our 28 focus countries we would consider fragile. And within those portfolios, about 25% of our portfolio in fragile states is on economic development. So it's a sizable spend, and obviously beyond that, it's not just about spend. There's obviously lots of low-cost interventions that influencing, etc., that will also have some impact. What we also found is that there's a subset of countries within our fragile states that are much harder to work in, and in those places, our portfolio is all over the place. So places like Afghanistan, we have significant spend. It's almost 75-80% of our portfolio. But other places like Yemen, which this review was done prior to what's going on currently in Yemen, our spend was extremely low even before what happens now. And obviously what's going on now is that our spend is significantly about humanitarian aid in Yemen. And then looking across that subset, we tried to understand a bit about, well, are there any similarities? And the answer is no, because it's all about the political economy. So what we're doing there is driven by what we can do, what we think makes sense, and also, to a certain extent, our own political imperatives and interests, and that changes with governments. We did look at what kinds of things we're doing. They tend to be things around livelihoods rather than broader economic growth, a lot of direct support to small businesses, and a lot of improving the business environment for domestic firms. And that's really a recognition of the fact that there's going to be very little investment into these places. And I think, just coming back to this question about why this small subset of countries, which includes places like Sudan, Yemen, Palestine, I think it's because we recognise it, for us it's relatively easy, and that's a very relative answer, to work in places like Kenya, as opposed to countries at the other extreme. So then we looked at what are we achieving, and with our mainstream programmes, I'm talking here, rather than things like the old conflict pool or the new conflict security and stability fund, and we basically, we're achieving our objectives in these places, and we are making very good steps on do no harm. But the objectives are all about economic development. They're not about peace building, not about state building. So we're not bringing those two things together. And we might be through the conflict pool if we think there are economic initiatives that can respond to conflict. But that's quite separate, I think, still in our programming, and we're still trying to bring those things together through the CSSF. So then we thought about, well, what does this mean? And there are some notable exceptions, I should say. So there's some quite interesting work in Somalia where they were looking at livelihoods and relating that to conflict, and a real recognition when they evaluated that programme that when we were going to do that kind of work, we really had to target it and think about who the beneficiaries are. And we haven't necessarily been that good at doing that either. So I'm just holding my hands up here and being honest. And then, so going forward, what are we thinking about? So we're in the process of going through this inclusive growth diagnostics process, which is looking across all our programmes and looking at constraints and opportunities for economic development. And we're trying to bring in a political economic lens to that, and a conflict lens to that. And it's working, but it's flagging up a big question, which I think is really relevant to all this work, about how do you get people from different disciplines to work together and bring those things, bring those kind of different groups of knowledge together and share and see things from each other's perspective. We definitely think that in these countries we should be thinking much more about working on conflict rather than working in conflict. And there's a recognition that in some places we are working around conflict, and that in itself may well be conflict inducing. So there are parts of some countries where we are deliberately not working because the security situation is just too difficult, but we need to be thinking about what kind of economic differentials might be being thrown up by that. We would still say there's value in doing economic development for its own sake, because we recognise that jobs are very much needed, livelihoods are very much needed in fragile states, and those are some of the big impacts of conflict. And then the other thing I'd say is about evidence, and I think you brought this up in the report, is that the evidence is so weak in these places, and we've been out trying to gather it, trying to put it together. We've got a conflict topic guide coming out through GSDRC this summer.
What? Sorry.
GSDRC, so the Government Social Development Research Centre, which we fund through the University of Birmingham, but it's a global public good, looking at this issue. But it's definitely a paucity of evidence on what works, and I think that for us is a real question mark about what we should be doing. And there's a second part to your question. I can't remember what it was.
No, I think that's really good. I was interested that you brought up that old or relatively old typology of working in conflict, on conflict, and around conflict, or around, in and on. Working in conflict is just working in a conflict area. Working on conflict is trying to do something about the conflict. And working around conflict is either, in the original definition, as you suggested, kind of pulling out, not working there, or else working as if conflict didn't exist. And I was just wondering, you're putting your hands up. Are there any examples of that you felt? Or do you feel that if you have the do no harm baseline in there, then that's looked after in a sense?
So again, holding my hands up, I went in thinking, we're going to find some examples that might make me a bit nervous. And what was interesting was actually all our country offices had found ways to bringing conflict sensitivity into what they were doing, and they different ways. So there were places like northern Nigeria where they contracted it out to a consortium who were delivering their programs, and part of that program delivery was an element of conflict sensitivity. Our Yemen program were drawing down conflict advisors at key points in the delivery stage. And then others, it was the main job of the conflict advisor to accompany those programs. So I think DFID has come on that, certainly.
So, I mean, as you know, an NGO would always be absolutely impossible to satisfy. So thanks for the conflict sensitivity. Now we'll move on to the positive contribution to peace building. But that's really interesting, and we're going to come back to it a lot. Ramani, I just wanted to ask you quite straightforwardly, from your perspective working in the BG group, what kind of resonance, if at all, does this report and these kind of topics have for you?
I mean, I think the topic has a lot of resonance, as Phil pointed out in the book. You can, or in his report, where you can argue endlessly what comes first, peace or prosperity or peace. But you're taking to the next level where you're saying businesses inherently are about economic development or engines for economic development, and in the course of your investment and all the activities that happen around your investment, proactively look at it also in terms of a positive contribution to peace, rather than the sort of the do no harm analogy where you look at conflict avoidance or conflict mitigation or doing the conflict sensitivity analysis. I mean, I think all of that is necessary. So I mean, if I use it in sociological terms, we would say the do no harm is a given. You would have to do that. I mean, that's your starting point, that's your foundation. But what would you do over and above that? And I mean, increasingly we have found, whether we are in developed or developing countries, whether we are in conflict and fragile countries or just simply emerging new economies, there are huge expectations that business value adds, and value adding is not just the fact that you are investing so many $1 billion into a country, and as a result of that it triggers you're a source of payments and revenues to government. You have to go well beyond that, well beyond your mandatory obligations or your contractual obligations to ensure that your presence in that country actually triggers sustainable economic activity that actually is retained within that country and benefits a wide group of people. So I mean, so we go into a country now with that explicit intention and purpose. Execution is obviously far more challenging. I think, picking up on your report again, I think some of the things we found is clearly this is not something we can do on our own. So you have to do this in partnership, and partnership with organizations that are actually expert and skilled in doing this kind of stuff, but also having the government support behind you, and I think people argue both ways, and in some cases the governance and the institutional capacity are so weak in those countries. Do you just do this as a sort of private sector initiative, or do you try to work it with the system? And I personally believe, and through my experience, that you need a hybrid, that a completely privatized approach means you get these sort of examples of islands of sort of excellence, if you like, but they're not really replicable. But I mean, I do have an interesting example actually working with DFID. I thought I should, highlight it, given the audience and the context. So in Tanzania, BG is potentially looking at a very large development in partnership with Statoil and Exxon and a couple of other companies. So we've been part of the huge gas finds in Tanzania, and we're looking at how you commercialize that opportunity to build an LNG plant. And we've been told very clearly by the Tanzanian government over and over again, and the people, that the only way they would support a massive LNG development is if that project actually translates into benefits for Tanzanians, Tanzanian jobs, Tanzanian businesses, Tanzanian skills. So that's an explicit sort of condition, if you like, even though that's not in our, explicitly in our PSA. And around the same time, DFID came to us, and under the sort of Justin Greening mandate, they kept saying they wanted to work with the private sector, and they kept asking us whether we would work with them, and we were like, well, there needs to be, we need to have a concrete basis to work together. I mean, yes, you want to work with the private sector. We recognize we need to have partners who are actually expert in development, but we want to do something that is concrete and tangible, and we are actually not interested in a partnership that is going to be conceptual and focused on sort of highly conceptual policy stuff. We want something that's tangible. So we suggested to DFID that we've done a lot of work on this, that we were really interested in a vocational and skills development program in Tanzania, which we had already started in partnership again with VSO and the government of Tanzania. And our sort of research had showed actually that 60% of the jobs from a massive LNG project are in the area of sort of technical skills. So the sort of management and professional category of jobs were basically sort of 5% of the jobs, and the unskilled jobs were probably like sort of the bottom sort of 20%. So the majority of jobs were in this category, and so we basically partnered with a vocational training college in Tanzania, or at least two of them, to basically design courses that would enable people to be trained in areas that could actually service the LNG sector, but also that were transferable and that would obviously meet with the quality, the standards that were required, the certification. So we got City and Guilds as a sort of subsidiary partner, English language training. So the British Council is another subsidiary partner providing that. And obviously from an oil and gas sector, you need health and safety. Safety is critical for us, so that people had proper safety training as well. And actually the programs have been hugely successful. I think one of the sort of inherent problems are you've got a lot of these vocational training colleges and people go in and get trained, but the training they provide don't meet the needs of industry. So on the one hand, industry faces a huge challenge in needing skilled workers but not being able to source them from their host countries because people aren't skilled, and on the other hand, people desperately needing jobs but having training that's not geared to the need of industry. So we try to sort of bring the two together. So we've got this in two vocational training institutes, and it's been very successful so far, but we clearly can't scale this project. It is not within our ask or capability. Neither can VSO scale, and neither can the Tanzanian government. So we told DFID, well, if you're interested, this is the sort of thing that we would be interested in partnering. And certainly you as a donor, one, you could be a convener and leverage other sort of funding for this, but you actually could partner with, say, someone like GIZ, which actually excels in implementation and training and work on scale. And well, believe it or not, there is a partnership called Skills for Oil and Gas in Africa. It focuses on 4 African countries, Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique and Uganda, and it's a partnership between DFID and GIZ are the two main donor partners. They've each put in almost equivalent sums of money over 5 years. Norred has now come in as a partner, and the explicit purpose of SOGA is like threefold. One, they explicitly want to work with the private sector, and the projects are only viable if they have industry participation, and that is to sort of address the challenge I described earlier. And the second is that it is implementation focused, and it actually delivers skills and jobs. So real skills for real people linked to real jobs. That it's measurable and clearly keeping, and with the donor philosophy, DFID is very keen that this targets those from the poorest segments of society. Now, I can make it complicated and say there are certain challenges there, because you would say those from the sort of poorest segments of society are quite often the least educated, and they don't have the base qualifications to even access these vocational training centers. So perhaps, the language may need to, and the focus may need to be changed a bit to, disadvantaged communities and disadvantaged regions, with the view that over time you also work at the entry level side of it to get people into those trainings. But that is an example. There are industry partners in each of the 4 countries, and companies like BG, Shell, Tallow, and Statoil have all committed to this program.
I mean, that sounds great, and thank you for that. I wanted to ask you, Lanre, to take a kind of slightly broader look, a step back. Across Africa or elsewhere, do you see examples of private sector, whether it's the national or even a very local or the international, working in this way? In a sense, you could say working not only for profit, but also for social outcomes, including in social outcomes that idea of contributing to a broader development and to the social peace.
It's certainly happening. And I think it's interesting to analyze some of the reasons as to why some of this is happening. First, a couple of examples. It's largely, when it comes to the international private sector, it's largely concentrated in big multinationals because they tend to have the scale, but also the international exposure, which sort of compels them to be a little bit more socially minded in some of their investing. So companies like Siemens now, include social impact as part of their core strategy. So they say the extent to which that is something that they can act on is uncertain, but it is happening. SAB Miller is another good example that has, really sort of has made a lot of headlines with some of the sustainable sort of farming initiatives that it has and how it sources its produce and how it runs its value chain. When you look at other asset classes like private equity, it doesn't get more cutthroat than private equity, but even that community is having to pay more and more attention to issues of sustainability and ESG and et cetera, because often they're international investors, basically just to cover themselves from a legal perspective, because you have things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the States, the anti-bribery legislation here in the UK. It's sort of a disciplining factor. So it is happening. And, I think that we have to be careful not to sort of get too carried away with the business narrative. So it is inevitable. So business and the private sector will have to play a critical role if Africa is to deliver on its economic potential. It's not even a debate. The money just isn't there. Not in a million years will it be financed by the public sector. The question, of course, is on what terms. Now, we'd all like to believe that, these days boardrooms are filled with enlightened, caring, empathetic human beings who worry as much about the bottom line as they do about the well-being of rural Africans. I'm skeptical about that. There might be some boardrooms like that out there, but on the whole, businesses are there for profit. So I think we have to be a bit mindful of not getting too exuberant on that. And at times with Africa, the narrative is, look, the state just needs to get out of the way. It's sort of, Africa is still kind of enthusiastic about neoliberalism when the rest of the world is starting to get a little bit cautious about some of its dogma. But this idea that just get the state out of the way, business will take over, is something that you hear a lot, which I would argue is very problematic. Now, just to sort of put a little bit more context to that, and to partially respond to your question to Phil earlier around who should be worrying about this and who should and can be carefree. Now, I would agree that nobody really should be carefree, but I would also argue that governments are the one entity, and the state across Africa is the one entity that should be losing sleep every single night of the week over how to actually make sure that money that is flowing into the country has some sort of meaning to the general population. And the big picture in Africa at the moment around that is that foreign direct investment is up, GDP growth is up. You may have heard of Africa's rising middle class and massive consumer market and so on and so forth. And a lot of big names are now big names in business are flocking to the continent. Facebook has just opened its first office with much fanfare. IBM has a big office in Kenya, as does Microsoft. Walmart is expanding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is that for most Africans, this is almost meaningless because that money is not touching their lives in any meaningful way. It's not creating jobs. It's not improving access to basic services like healthcare and education. It's not improving social mobility in most cases. And in some cases, Nigeria is a very striking example. What you've got is rampant economic growth and investment going hand in hand with rampant and sharply increasing poverty and conflict. Nigeria over the last 10 years has presided over the most prolific period of growth and investment in its history, which has probably also been its most violent and most insecure period since its civil war back in the 1960s. So there's a clear disconnect between the development story on Africa right now and the growth story. The growth story is compelling. There's certainly money to be made, but making money and contributing to some sort of bigger picture are not, that there's just no natural connection between the two. Now, I think it's not realistic to expect business to take on the mantle. And to Ramani's point earlier, what you get are pockets of excellence, basically. You get these striking examples of here's what you could do, but and love it or hate it, and it's kind of boring, but you always get back to the same issue, which is, well, ultimately this comes down to government policy. And if the policies are bad, it doesn't matter how much money is pouring into an economy, you will not create jobs. You will not, improve education. You will not improve public services. And, it's an obvious point to make, but I don't think you can skirt around it. And I would say if anyone needs, if anyone needs to be pressured in terms of actually integrating peace building into economic planning or into any sort of economic activity, it has to be governments. There's a lot more to be said about it, but I'll just stop there.
Okay, well, that's really great. What I want to do now, I'm going to ask Phil, giving him the privilege of having done all the work on the report, if there's stuff that he wants to comment, see if then there's comment on the comment, and then come straight out to ask you for your comments and your questions. So, Phil, were there things in what the other three panelists were saying, what Juliet, Ramani and Lanre were saying?
I pick up two things, which not so much responding to a thing was said, but two emerging things there. I think one is just picking up what Lanre was saying. So who's putting the pressure? I think one of the really interesting things looking at corporates broadly, if you look at the extractive sector, because that's an easy one to look at, an obvious one in terms that we're talking about, I would say there's this interesting sort of linear narrative coming from 1960 to the present day, where you could say that the oil and mining companies had discovered or were forced to discover health and safety, early 1960s. Some 10 years later, they were forced to discover environment. Then they discovered community. And I think what's really interesting now is they're discovering society. And see this language of corporate citizenship. Now, companies, beware the language you use on your websites, because we'll use it back, Citizenship is not a small word. So I've had a conversation with a couple of mining companies where I've said, so you pay this, so you happily claim that you're the second biggest taxpayer in polity A. So how do you show the government what you think that taxes should be used for? Because that's what a citizen does. And you're a mega citizen, because you're paying much more taxes than anyone else. No, we don't do that. Well, of course you do behind closed doors on issues like infrastructure and stuff like that. We know that. But are you actually exercising the responsibility, not the right, the responsibility of a large tax-paying corporate citizen in polity A to say, we've also got some advice to you, dear government, about how you might use some of this. And I go back to my framework, the third outcome I talked about is revenues and services, or taxes and services. They go together. So I think there's more that can be done, including by corporate voices, but of course by civil society as well, by citizens, non-corporate citizens, to put that pressure on it. I would say that's a sort of a long burn issue. That's sort of improving governance, and that takes a while. There might be thresholds, but that takes a while. That's one issue. So I think there's more that corporate citizens, amongst others, could be doing to say, we have an interest in how the taxes we pay are spent. It seems only right to me, because that's what I think as a voter in this country. That's what I vote on, after all. That's the main job of Parliament, is fiscal. So that's one thing. The second thing is on jobs. And I think we, I was saying to someone before, so we all know that jobs are a major factor jobs or the lack thereof are a major factor in conflict. It can be exaggerated by some researchers and others, and by politicians, but it's quite clear that the devil does make work for idle hands, and idle hands of young men especially can be brought to wreak havoc. And so jobs or economic activities for those young people, especially young men, is really important. Now, private sector. I got a thing about private sector. You're offering me to go off on a riff here, so I have to be careful.
Well, careful.
So private sector is kind of everything. We've kind of, those of us who are not in it have somehow reified it as being this other thing. The private sector, I encountered it so many times on my way over here. I was engaged in it every time I bought something. So even the tube has private sector in it. So let's not see it as something other and magical. The private sector is not going to create enough jobs to prevent young people from being drawn into conflict in Tunisia, in Sierra Leone, in Niger, and in Nigeria, and all the other places, if that's a factor. So if we genuinely believe that jobs is a problem, then let's find some interim measure. I think this is where donors can come in, and governments, of course, can come in. Can we find some interim measure and look at maybe some large public sector infrastructure projects, which are perhaps high labour-intensive projects? I know it seems old-fashioned, it's like going back to old-style development programming. But if our task is not development, but peaceful development, I think we need to perhaps look back at some of these things. Yes, we need to be careful. You don't want to flood the labour market with public money and push out the private sector. But we understand, I think, more about these things than we used to do. So I think jobs, the companies are clearly, as big and small, are clearly going to be the ones creating the jobs, including peasant farmers. They're in the private sector too. But in the meantime, I think there's a good use of public money in fragile places where we know there's a risk, is to work with governments and the private sector and so on, and civil society, possibly to create 25, 30-year programs of infrastructure development. And that infrastructure can also be designed as peacebuilding infrastructure. It's also good for the economy. So you can get a sort of triple win out of that. So I think those are the two things that came out for me.
Okay, well, look, let's come out to the audience then. There's one, have we got a roving mic? Yes, there's one coming over here. Yep.
Thank you. Hello. My name's Adam Feinberg. I work in economic development. I've worked with Phil and others in terms of working party feeding into this report. Firstly, I want to say that I think it's really useful to have a framework and just to capture good practice, do some research about what's happening, what could happen, and how things be governed. Secondly, I'd just like to talk about, sort of picking up just now on Phil's points, something about proactive work and planning for promotion of peace building, peace conducive economic development, rather than on the back of something around social impact analysis and so on, because there's a need for greater proactive work around that. And again, I think there's something about the role of people like DFID who provide funding, hard funding for infrastructural work, structural programs, as well as very local projects, and likes people like BG and corporates to recognise that a framework like this, if they were to adopt it and value it as good practice, in their decision making, in their programming, as something to be adhered to, then that's going to give a really good boost and drive for something like this. Whether it's the right framework or not, as Phil said from the outset, whatever the framework is, something built on a revision or a variation on this report, then it's something using the tools of government, using the tools of donors, using the tools of the private sector, that can really begin to create an impetus and a driver for the actors, the state, the private sector, the local community actors as well, of course, to actually have a compact and come round and realise and understand all of these issues. There's very good practice. I worked 20 years ago in Israel-Palestine. I wrote discussion papers for the multilateral peace talks, the Oslo round, around the Red Sea Riviera, economic development and tourism in East Jerusalem. I worked also in Bethnal Green on regeneration and reconciling community tensions between the Bengali population and native English population. And I know international work does a lot of work like this as well. But we have to look at it at different levels, and we have to recognise there is a body of work at different levels by different actors to support community cohesion, economic development, and good relationships within groups, within states and regions, as well as international. And really, we need to capture that good practice, under a framework which is recognised by the donors and other big players.
Okay, you said something really nice about us, and you said something really useful about frameworks. Do you have a question as well?
Well, I suppose my point really is maybe to people like DFID and to the BG representative, to what extent do they think it's feasible to take on board something like this framework and recognise it through the work that they do, the investments they undertake, to govern the work to ensure that their investments are peace conducive?
Super, thanks a lot. There was a question down here. I'll collect a little cluster of them because I can see some hands on the move. So there was one here, and I see 2, 3 more now. So we'll take these 2 first and then come to the others.
Hi, I've got one question, which was I'd gone to a conference with regards to sustainable mining at UCL a few months ago, and I'd spoken with the lecturer afterwards and realised that even she realised that the sustainable mining is a bit of an oxymoron. It doesn't really make sense because you're trying to validate digging the hell out of the earth and actually not putting anything back. So my question was, with regards to these communities, big continents like Africa, big countries like India, where they've got so many natural resources, where the local communities are not getting support from their governments, and 50, 100 years later we go back in and we're offering them help? Or is it just a 21st century version of colonialism again, and actually not really offering them help, just offering them big corporations who are then, if the laws are passed in the US, through the TRIPS agreements, they're going to be able to do whatever they want to do and bypass the international organizations and say to the governments, if you don't want it, we'll just sue the hell out of you. So what is the people's response to that?
Okay, good, thank you. Juliet,
So
is it 21st century colonialism,
It's
what you're doing?
What we're doing. I think it would be quite hard to say that what we're doing is 21st century colonialism, mainly because a lot of it is making markets work for the poor. So it's going into very fragile states, very poor countries, looking at market systems and trying to understand where there are weaknesses and where poor people don't have access to those markets and helping them have access to those places. So it's less about our strategic vision for where we see ourselves in the world and more about poverty reduction, I would say.
Phil, can I ask you, I mean, you've worked in Africa for, what, how long, 20 years before you, 25 years before you came to work for Alert? 20. What do you feel emotionally about the issue which the last question was raising? I mean, about the fact that we, the white West, have exploited Africa. How, I mean, you know, you've read the book about Congo. I can't recall the figures of how many people were killed in 50 years of Belgian exploitation, but it's how frightening, it's a horrendous figure, and that may have been the worst, but there were other awful things being done all across the continent. And now there we are, and there you have been trying to do some good. How do you respond? What does your heart tell you about those kinds of issues?
Well, my heart tells me that what's all those things are terrible, obviously. I think so. As a British person who dabbles in other people's lives, there is an element of, you could call it colonialism if you like, because I bring my idea of better to that task. And I can't avoid doing that. It is impossible to avoid doing that. And I think be I, in the private sector, be NGO, be DFID, etc., we cannot avoid, if we're not just going to ignore everyone else in the world, we've got to bring who we are to the question of how things can be better. So I think right from the beginning there's an issue there, but I can accept that because I think as long as one is trying to do things well and making sure that other people see it as you're doing things well, that can be okay. I think, can I just bring my brain into gear as well, if that wasn't my brain? I think it was, I think, so Paul Collier wrote quite eloquently about the issue of, and this issue about sustainability. Of course, companies will, one can call things sustainable. There's a way to do things more sustainably or less sustainably. And I think when film brings social sustainability in, it enables companies and all of us to think more openly about it. Paul Collier had a very neat way, I think, of thinking about mining and extraction of minerals. He says it's the patrimony, and you can only take it out once. And his recommendation, if I recall, is that it's capital and it should be used to recapitalize society. So that's the right way, textbook way to use stuff you dig out of the ground. Don't use it for recurrent costs. Use it for capital improvement, human capital, infrastructure capital, political improvement, etc. I think that's quite a good way to think about it, but I cannot be the person to define what is the best way for people to use those resources. But I come back to my thing about all of us should be interested in how taxes are used, revenues and taxes. If a mining company goes into Congo now, or Uganda, wherever, or an oil company, the chances are they're going to be taking out something which is not particularly added value. It doesn't have much value added to it. I remember Rio Tinto having this big project in Guinea which got taken away from them, and they were saying it was going to double GDP, one mine, double the country's GDP, one mine. Probably it was going to produce a maximum of 5,000 jobs, if even that. That's terrifying, I think. So I think we've got to pay a lot of interest in how the taxes, the revenue, royalties and taxes are used by the government. And I come back to my point that I made before. I think that everyone who's got influence over that has got to exercise that influence and not worry too much about the neo-colonial element to it, because if we believe in human rights, that's what we bring to the task.
And Lanre, can I ask you to respond as well? I mean, is it 21st century colonialism? Should we be worrying about that? Are you worrying about that?
Not really. I'd be curious to hear the young man's thoughts on China and Africa if you think the West is on a neo-colonial crusade. If Africa is subject to a neo-colonial takeover over the next 30 or 40 years, I'll obviously be quite disappointed, but I'll be pointing the finger of blame at Africa. It's that simple. I think that there is often an underestimation of the agency of Africans in the misfortune that you see across the continent. The reality is that in many cases, you need look no further than the government when it comes to figuring out what's really going wrong. Let me give you one example. So in Nigeria, one of our favorite pastimes is bashing Shell and bashing the oil companies, and rightly resenting their role and their complicit responsibility in the destruction of the Niger Delta and the crippling of the Nigerian economy. But what is often left out of that equation is that the Nigerian government, of course, takes home the majority of all the oil revenue. So, and of course, oil companies operate in Nigeria at the invitation often of the government. So the difference between an oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf of Guinea in Nigeria is with the government. It has nothing to do with the oil company. I mean, Shell can get away with it in Nigeria because it knows it can just pay off. It can just pay off, whoever needs to be paid off. So I think that this is obviously an issue that one encounters a lot. And my impression is that across Africa, there's still at times a tendency to be the victim. What I often point out is Africa was not the only part of the world that was colonized. A lot of places were colonized. A lot of places went through equal and worse experiences than a lot of sub-Saharan African countries. Some of those economies are doing much better today. And I would say partly that is because they're not looking to blame the outsider. If China runs away with Africa's resources, it will be Africans who are to blame, not China, because they're not bombing anyone, they're not threatening to bomb anyone, they're not threatening to invade anyone or take over any land. If they start doing that, it's a different ballgame. But if all they're doing is signing corrupt deals with officials who are willing to be corrupt, who do you blame? The Chinese, who are obviously looking out for themselves, as are the Americans, as are the British ultimately. I mean, why would we expect China to be in Africa to develop Africa? They've got plenty of work to do at home. Obviously, they're there for their own long-term gain. But that doesn't mean it's just a free-for-all where you just throw up your hands and you're just a helpless victim. It's up to you to negotiate proper deals. And there the common refrain is, but we have no capacity. This big oil company comes in here with all these fancy lawyers. We're just a poor government. I know of unfortunate anecdotes where basically governments have been where there's been a long line of people who've been willing pro bono to come in to help negotiate, a big oil deal or a big resource deal, and the government has decided not to take advantage of that help. I think enough people are fed up with the resource curse across Africa, in Africa, and elsewhere. I don't think that it's a legitimate excuse these days for an African government to say we can't muster the resources to negotiate properly. I think the elephant in the room is always, look, corruption, and it's still rampant. It's still just rampant. Anyway, sorry, that's sort of a beginning of an answer to that question. There's a lot more to be said about it, but let's not get.
Okay.
We can discuss that later. I think it's rotten, but that's we can discuss that later.
It's okay. I want to go to the first question, because that was a question directly posed towards, I think, Ramani and to Juliet. So asking Ramani first. The point was that this framework, which is in the report, could be perhaps very helpful, maybe needs a tweak or maybe needs more than that to change it, to make it just the way it should be. But do you think that it is feasible to think about private sector actors and actors like DFID or other agencies? You've mentioned NORAD or CEDA or GIZ, so on, the other development agencies in Europe, USAID, whomever, perhaps the international financial institutions, I don't know, working together on a common framework on this kind of issue for guiding private sector investment and activity?
I mean, the short answer is yes. I think the report offers an interesting perspective on sort of all problems. It also talks about you can approach the same issue and also the same actions from different frameworks, and you can also get to the same place potentially. So there are a myriad of frameworks out there. There's the Human Rights Impact Assessment Framework, there are the IFC performance standards, there's the DFID sort of livelihood framework, there are value chain frameworks, there are supply chain frameworks. So, if I'm very honest, I would say as a company, we don't necessarily need more frameworks. It is good to have new ideas about how to look at it. It's good to have different perspectives of the same problem, but a framework is not necessarily our answer to a solution, because I think there are a lot of frameworks out there, and the framework just gives you. It gives you a reference point to looking at something, but I would not necessarily say this framework is going to be the basis for partnering with DFID and GIZ, because, like I gave the example before, we already have a partnership that's looking at some of these issues. So, but maybe DFID's got a different.
Juliet, what's your take on it?
Yeah, so I think similar that we already have a number of tools ourselves, and you referenced some of it in terms of political economy analysis. We have our JAX methodology for looking at conflict and stability. And I think it's less about frameworks and more about just how we're thinking. And I think the sort of two big areas that we're really aware of that we need to do better is this interdisciplinary working between economists, private sector development advisors, governance advisors, conflict advisors. And part of that is actually getting conflict advisors and governance advisors to understand economic development better. And that's certainly for me has been a very steep learning curve over the last 3 years, and I think it's for others. And then the other part is about building evidence about what works, and that's the bit where we really scratch our heads. What should we be doing to promote peace through economic development?
Okay, let's take another group of questions. I'd seen three, and the same three hands have gone. So starting with him at the back, then him in the middle, and then him at the front.
Hello, I'm Nestor from City of London Corporation. And I guess I've got two questions, if I may. The first one is about how much of our thinking about disaster risk reduction and the role of the private sector in disaster risk reduction through things like encoding risk into insurance industry and into finance industry and kind of limiting how much new risk is created by investment. How much of that is being translated into the kind of conflict side of the role of the private sector in development? Kind of, are we learning lessons and putting those lessons across? And I guess the other question is to do with again, the link between disaster risk reduction and the work that we're doing on sustainable development. And we said, kind of, when we were running up to Sendai, well, this is the first of a number of different discussions that we're having. And then we sort of finished the Sendai negotiations and now forgot the Sendai negotiations. So it seems like we forgot the Sendai negotiations. Have we forgotten the Sendai negotiations? I'm sure you'll say no, but can you tell us a bit more of how you haven't forgotten the Sendai negotiations?
And the next one in the middle here, hand that just went up. Just before you do, just to be sure, you can indicate with nodding or shaking your head if I'm wrong. The first question was about the translation of the sort of the product of thinking about disaster risk reduction, and particularly thinking about insurance risk management into or onto the conflict side of the picture. Okay, good. Please, sir.
Eric Gutierrez from Christian Aid. I haven't read the report, but I wanted to go back to the question that Dan asked in the beginning, which is it possible to build prosperity in a way that builds peace? Now, I thought that the term prosperity needs to be unpacked and needs to be further developed, and because prosperity can be made at the back of there was a lot of prosperity during the slavery era, on the back of a lot of exploitation. So I thought that maybe what may be important to ask is to tweak that question a bit, and maybe ask, is it possible for business to be concerned with the inequality and how it's being reproduced in the places where they work, and can markets be designed to reduce inequalities, and what's necessary for the business sector. I think it's important to have that explicit term inequality to be mentioned in a discussion like this, because if we just discuss prosperity without looking at the other side, which is inequality, then I think Lanre was saying that Nigeria, there's a lot of investment going in, a lot of prosperity being made, but also a lot of inequality being made. And if that's not being addressed, then you just create that recurring cycle of conflict.
Sure.
And I think there's also a lot of creativity now not in some private sector companies in terms of dealing with this. Well, my example is the work that Coca-Cola is now doing. So, for example, they're selling.
Sorry, the work that who is?
Coca-Cola, the soft drinks company. They're selling these cans in the Middle East without any word. It's just the color red and white, and then at the bottom there it says that the labels are for cans, not for people. So it's some kind of they're still selling those cans, but they're making a symbolic statement that don't label people. And then in Myanmar they got into a bit of a pickle because the local subsidiary that they partnered with turned out to be a company that has a lot of they were involved in jade mining and were involved in a lot of land grabbing and human rights violations. And but I think what the company did was to sort of create a space where their local subsidiary, the local partner, can discuss with Global Witness, who is doing some campaigns around this. So maybe that can also be a role that the private sector can do, is the creation of those spaces where that kind of interaction can take place.
Okay.
So it's So just that point about
unpacking
focus
prosperity.
On inequality.
Prosperity for whom, and the potential, the creation of space. And then there was one here at the front in the white shirt, and then we'll try to take those three together. And
Richard Black from SOAS, and I'd like to ask a question to all members of the panel other than Phil. Phil has talked about using infrastructure projects for peace building, and in a context where Africa and indeed other parts of the developing world are experiencing unprecedented rates of growth in major roads, and Africa is also experiencing rail projects and some continuing new dam projects that are classically seen as ways of the state extending power and often lead to conflict. What do you see as a potential way, or do you see any potential way of delivering peace building through the real infrastructure projects that are happening today, and how would you do it?
Okay, well, we'll take that one first because that was so explicit that Phil can't answer it. Lanre.
I mean, I can't answer that question. My response to it would be, I'd be glad if the infrastructure just gets built, to be honest with you, at this point. I would argue that in most cases, rural populations will be quite pleased to see a road appear, to see a power plant appear. Obviously, there are cases where infrastructure expansion will collide head-on with communities, with people. But on the whole, the biggest problem is there is no infrastructure right now. And if you could switch on the lights, if you could just have access to electricity across sub-Saharan Africa, I think the minority would be upset about it. I think the majority would be over the moon that something's actually being done, because the infrastructure issue is, it's so frustrating, because if you could crack only access to electricity, never mind growing at 4 or 5%, sub-Saharan Africa could be growing at 10, 15% or something ludicrous like that. Nigeria could be growing at 15, 20% a year, credibly, if you could just get access to electricity. So for me, my answer is, as long as it gets built at this point, I don't really care.
Okay. Ramin?
I certainly share your point about, the need for infrastructure in Africa, and otherwise you're going to have this very unequal situation of growth on the one side, but access to the opportunities from that growth to be extremely limited because the infrastructure is not there. But I think there are other enabling factors. Phil said he'd like to see the transfer of some of these revenues that are paid through some of these mega projects converted into infrastructure, which can then, become a trigger for engaging youth in work that would, essentially, reduce, the conflict factor. But I think the corruption factor becomes a massive issue when you talk about infrastructure development. So again, it is how that infrastructure is developed, who controls that, the quality of infrastructure that's delivered, who benefits both in terms of the actual construction of those projects, but then also in terms of the design and how those projects are designed, the prioritization in terms of what projects, where, for whom, etc. So I don't think you can address the infrastructure issue without talking about the corruption issue, if you're talking about it as in terms of a positive, in terms of conflict and economic development.
And Juliet?
Great, so I'm really happy you asked this question because it's one of my favourite areas. My question, my answer to that is similar, but it's also about development financing institutions and how they are behaving. And we talk a lot, and you talked a lot earlier about environmental, social governance issues, but I've looked at those in quite a lot of detail, and in my view, they don't go far enough. They need to be. A lot of what they do is risk management for the DFIs involved, and what they need to be doing is thinking much more about what does this mean? How am I an actor? What's actually happening in this environment? Am I contributing to conflict? And I don't think that anyone has really cracked that yet. The Equator Principles are much more about ESG, not about conflict sensitivity. I don't have the answer, but I think we need to be thinking about it in those terms. And DFID very much part of that with our private infrastructure development group, which does a lot of financing of infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, great. I'm really pleased with the diversity of the view given. Phil, I'm coming to you now, but you're not allowed to answer that question. You can answer
a story about an infrastructure project I was once involved in.
You can answer the question about unpacking prosperity.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, I think one can. So I think to your specific question, yes, the nature of prosperity is hugely important in terms of its contribution to peace or not. And I think I didn't really go into the details when I was speaking earlier, but I think it's in the report that when we talk about the four outcomes of decent livelihoods, of savings opportunities and investment opportunities, of revenue and spend on services, and on the sort of social and environmental sustainability, sort of inherent in all that, there are qualitative issues about who participates in the prosperity. And that's not just about who gets more or less income. It's, I think, in line with what you were suggesting, it's who participates in society in some of these decisions. And I think the Coca-Cola one, I'm not sure if I fully understood the Myanmar example, but if I could sort of just infer, assume some things about it, there's a real opportunity there in what I think you were saying Coca-Cola is trying to do. Let's say that perhaps in Myanmar one of the peace issues is a lack of democracy, a lack of experience of democracy. Let's say that in normal human parlance that means I don't get to participate in decisions which affect my life from the perspective of a person in Myanmar. Now there's a problem which has come about, which is perceived by the I who just made that statement, a Burmese person, for example. Now, if Coca-Cola can create a situation in which I am now being brought in to ask what I think about this problem which has occurred, there's a little bit of democracy in action taking place, and I, who have grown up in a dictatorship, am starting to get an imprint of what participation feels like beyond what I'm used to. And I believe there's a word for that, in jurists have a word for that, but anyway, that's the beginning of me internalizing a slightly more empowered sense of self in my society than I had before, even though I haven't described it the way Phil has just described it on my behalf, if you get my point. So I think where there's problems, there is democratic opportunities, and democracy, certainly in the long term, is thought to be good for peace, even though we know it can create difficulties on the way. Could I say anything about infrastructure?
Oh, go on.
Infrastructure is not only huge. Infrastructure, seen by the person I was just talking about, can be quite small. I've worked on a project which I think was quite successful. It was in northern Uganda during the height of the conflict, during the conflict there. And so this was a B roads or a C roads infrastructure project, high labour intensity project, what I was talking about before, but not huge. It was run by an NGO, which I was involved in. And so very political. So we had some funds actually given by the US government in that case for the NGO I was working for, which was to create some sort of pre-peace dividends, if you like, because we thought that things were getting better, and they did in the end. This was for creating work and rebuilding minor roads to try and get the economy back going again. This was the idea of being ready for peace to come. And this is crucially for people who mostly were not in IDP camps. Most people in that part of Uganda were already in IDP camps. There was a sort of peace purpose in keeping people away from these concentration camps if possible, if it was safe for them. So it had lots of purposes, this project. How do we decide, the key point I think is how do we decide which roads to do? We went first of all to the local councils and said, we've got this opportunity, which roads should we do? Obviously, choices were proposed to us which were entirely political and not necessarily peace building. Luckily, we still had some control over the decision making, so we worked that through and then we got communities involved. It took a lot longer, that's the key thing. It took a lot longer to work through which were the roads we should do and, crucially, how we should do them. We ended up having this kind of ridiculous system from an economics perspective of using villagers from one community to do this bit of road and then, sorry, you're finished now, move to the next one. And looking it back to our framework here, we agreed with the people who came to work for the project that we would save some of their money on their behalf. So they had a little bit of capital at the end of their bit of work, which we then provided them with some sort of petty economic development training, small economic development training, so if they wanted to, they could set up small businesses. So all of that, I think one can spin, and we did spin, and I do spin, as being useful for peace. But it's small infrastructure, not necessarily the huge stuff.
And Juliet, or Phil, I would guess, though either of the other two of you jump in if you do have something. The first question there about the DRR and the transfer of risk insurance management approaches, or risk management approaches in insurance, over onto the conflict side. Are you aware of things happening there?
I could try and answer that question.
Go ahead.
I actually manage a political risk insurance program through the World Bank Group. So a really interesting question actually, and it comes back to kind of my response on the infrastructure question, is that so it is very much a risk management approach, and looking at how, for example, MEGA, as part of the World Bank Group, work with investments that they are insuring. It's largely about protecting their reputation, protecting the risk to them, and it's not really about how am I an actor in this environment? What might, I mean, there's obviously due diligence around politically exposed people, but more about who might those people be beyond, how does the political economy hang together, what do I need to be thinking about, and what do my clients need to be thinking about as well? And I would, I think there's a massive opportunity to think about that much more and move beyond risk management to think about how can we promote peace and how can we actually contribute positively to stability rather than just protecting ourselves yeah.
Phil,
No, I think that's very
wiped your brow with relief, Lanre?
Just a short comment on the need to unpack prosperity. I mean, I would argue, or I suspect most of us in the room here would agree with that statement, but it is, it's so fundamental. I can't speak to other parts of the world, but it's so fundamental to where Africa is right now. And my concern is that it's not being taken seriously enough. There is talk about it, but the real world implications of an environment in which the gap, the already huge chasm between the haves and have-nots is actually increasing at a time when money is being thrown at the continent, that's a recipe for conflict if ever I've heard of one. And it's not really being taken seriously at government level, which I would argue is the most important arena in which it has to be taken seriously, because the unemployment figures on Africa are scary, and the reality is that many countries don't have 15 or 20 years to figure it out. You need radical change in the next 3 to 5 years, otherwise you're really sitting on a powder keg. We sometimes talk of Africa's demographic dividend. 60% of the population is under 25. If things continue like this, 60% of the population is going to be unemployed in the next 10 years, and you don't want that.
Okay, I think we're getting towards the point in the evening when the clock is really working against us, but there was one hand here which I nodded at, and there's another one there which for a very obvious reason I'm going to accept. So those two, the one's closer to you, right? Okay, and then it's two rows back. So quick questions, quick responses, and then I have a sign-off question which I want everybody to answer. You're not getting away without answering it.
Okay, the issue of demographics was just mentioned, and I have the feeling that a big chunk of what we're discussing here today takes place in rural environments, such as infrastructure building, resource exploration. I wonder what do you feel about the challenges of urbanization? Because Africa, the urban population growth is one of the big stories of the century in Africa. Are institutions or organizations like DFID willing and ready to tackle precisely the specific challenges of peace building in urban environments, such as slums, infrastructure in cities? It's a very challenging topic, but are we willing and ready to tackle it for peace building purposes?
Yeah, I think it relates to a big question, which is when we think about development and development aid, are we essentially thinking about a rural world when the reality has moved on and Africa, like everywhere else, is urbanizing at an extraordinary rate? And then there was a question right there.
Hi, I'm Ameya from Conciliation Resources. Really enjoyed reading the executive summary of the report because I think it makes a very simple argument very well. So thank you for sharing this. I had two very quick questions. One was to do with this idea of political economy, and the question one of the panelists also talked about is why would companies care about integrating peace building into their normal programs? And I guess this kind of points back to the fact that companies are part of the political economy. It's not something objectively out there that they're analyzing. And so I was wondering if, especially for agencies like DFID, but also most of us who are working in conflict-affected countries, is this kind of analysis something to take into account in deciding which levers to pull in the first place, whether to work with the private sector or big corporations as opposed to working with smaller civil society organizations? So I just wondered what the panelists thought about that. And the second quick question I had was around political issues. And this idea of peace through prosperity, I think, is a really good, catchy way of framing an idea. But I wonder if the danger with that is, especially with governments, in simplifying something that's not that simple, in that very often governments take the same approach of throwing money at a problem or saying, oh yeah, we have a long-standing political dispute, let's try and introduce jobs, let's bring some infrastructure. And what we found is very often, no, that doesn't lead to youth radicalization going away. So, or, various other conflict dynamics.
Great.
So that was the other.
Thanks. So, 4 of you, 3 questions, because she got away with adding 1. The urban dimension, the use of a political economy lens in deciding on how to engage from the very outset. Is that feasible? Does that make sense? And in some senses, are we being too simple? I'll start from the other end and give you each. You don't have to answer all 3.
Sure.
You have to answer at least 1.
On urbanization, I grew up in a city called Lagos in Nigeria. And I don't know how many people in this room have been to Lagos, but if anywhere on earth exemplifies the challenges, and I think challenges is a very charitable word here, of rapid urbanization in a context of low industrial development, it's Lagos. Now, I'm not sure, I'll let Juliet speak for what DFID is going to do about urbanization. I'm not sure that there's a whole lot you can do, really. I mean, Lagos is, depending on who you ask, somewhere between 15 and 20 million people, because no one really knows how many people live in Lagos. And much of it is slums. The euphemism is informal settlements, but it's mostly slums. And every day, people are pouring into Lagos, the same way people think that, if you just get across the Mediterranean, you'll have a semi-detached house and a garage. It doesn't quite work out that way. Lagos is already woefully under-resourced. Its infrastructure cannot even begin to dream of coping with the load that's there. Again, to be very boring, I would argue that rather than having to be super creative around how you manage urbanization across Africa, it comes down to the same thing, good and bad policies. If local and national governments are passing really bad policies, guess what? Lagos is still going to be a slum 50 years from now. If they're getting the policies right, and I'm not saying it's easy, there's nothing easy about that, but if they're getting the policies right, there's no reason why, over time things will improve. I think sometimes, we want things to just change overnight. We don't want people to live in poverty. The reality for most Lagosians is they're going to live in poverty for the next 30 or 40 years, even if the government gets everything right today. But if the government doesn't get it right, it's going to go on. For me, I think the best example of this is Seoul, South Korea, back in the 1950s and 1960s, which from what I've read and what I've heard, was by all accounts a sub-Saharan African city with a huge garbage dump right in the middle of it. I imagine if you went to Seoul these days, you could not even conceive of that being the case. So I would argue it's definitely possible. But in South Korea, I would argue it was really down to the government getting it right. And I'm not romanticizing it in any way, problematic in many ways, but you can't really argue with the results these days.
Ramani?
Yeah, well, I'll take the political economy question because I think that was also directed at companies and the private sector. And I definitely take your point as a mega investor in a country where you could potentially be a major part of a country's GDP. You are part of the political economy. And do companies look at it that way? I certainly hope so. I think we certainly do. So we would do both sort of local environmental and social impact analysis and your sort of conflict sensitive analysis if you're in a fragile country and all that stuff. But we also do macro level economic analysis and look at what the impact of our project would be on the country's economy, on policy, on governance over the life of a project. And we find from a company perspective, sometimes the most valuable thing for the government is actually getting that information in an accessible way. If you are not a long-standing resource, say in the extractive sector, if you're a country that's new to the extractive sector, that is not information a government would have at its disposal. And they would not understand how the revenues flow over a 30-year project where initially the company has to invest billions and billions of dollars to actually get that project established. And then, over time, what the revenue sort of flow pattern would look like for the government and how, the government can move into a surplus potentially if it manages its revenue flow well. So providing that information to the government, explaining that information, making it accessible, I think is very important. as obviously then the next step, which is what you do in terms of policy reform and institutional capability development and stuff, which is not, the private sector can play the role, but it cannot be the protagonist there. Absolutely not.
Phil?
Yeah, maybe take two questions. I mean, are we oversimplifying? Absolutely. I was only allowed to have this many pages, and I only have this brain. I think as soon as one takes an idea and takes it away from a case, straight away one is oversimplifying. I think that's okay, because the whole point of this this discussion and this sort of report is to question, stimulate, offer, etc., etc., etc. So it's not proposing any more than that. I think, so one of the things we put in the report is the idea that decriminalisation of drugs in the UK, as an example, could have quite an impact on peace in barrios in Latin America, for example, indeed on transshipment routes in the Sahel. I'm not thinking that's going to happen very soon, but I still think it's quite a good example. So it shows that sort of causality, chain of causality, and perhaps somebody will read the reports and go, aha, David Cameron. And then and similar to that, on the companies thing, I mean, as you just said, Romani, the companies are very adept at political economy analysis already. Could some of them perhaps add this intention that Dan talked about of contributing to what we're calling peace? They can call it what they like, as long as it sort of meets those sort of the ideas of peace. I think yes, because I don't think companies started back in the 60s on that chain of evolution I talked about, looking at the health and safety and then the environment and social space. That happened because of external pressures. I can't completely explain them all, but those pressures are continuing to happen. Some companies, this idea of shared value, which came from academia, but is being quoted and adopted in some forward-thinking companies, is taking root in those companies. And if the world continues to become better in the way I'm thinking about now, I think that space will expand. I believe it will, but we can't make it happen.
Juliet?
So on urbanisation, absolutely, I think we recognise that that the shift from people moving into urban areas is still ongoing. We have work ongoing at the moment to develop a policy framework, which I think is for internal consumption only, which looks exactly at that. What does this mean? What should we be doing? And actually, I and a colleague, another conflict advisor, commented on it about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we're trying to bring in that conflict lens to that work. On political economy lenses and working with the private sector, again, absolutely, we do quite a lot of due diligence on our partners, and part of that is understanding what their approaches are to political economy analysis and conflict. Some we might work with even if we think they're relatively weak, because we think it's an opportunity to try and influence them to do more on those areas.
Okay, we're now coming to the last round, which is a question which I've been saving up to ask these four. It's the same question to each of them, and they each have 1 minute to answer. And they have to understand that if they go on beyond the 1 minute, they're standing between us and the refreshments in the room next door. And it's quite simple. It's not really, but anyway. If you could sit down now with somebody who has influence and power, and you could give that person 1 or 2 pieces of advice about what to do in order to build a good and shared prosperity in a way that builds peace, who would that person be, and what would your advice be? Lanre.
So, very quickly on the thought process, person I would choose is President Buhari of Nigeria, not because I particularly want to meet him, not because I think he would be particularly interesting to speak to, but because Nigeria's success is intrinsically linked with the success of an entire continent, and decisions made in Nigeria are probably more important than decisions made anywhere else in Africa today. And the conversation would be a very boring one, and I'd probably get thrown out fairly quickly, because my advice to him would be just one word, which I will repeat relentlessly, regardless of what he says to me, and it's institutions. Institutions, institutions, institutions. I want him to have nightmares about institutions. I want him to daydream about institutions, because if he does nothing else, if he can strengthen Nigeria's institutions, the potential ramifications of that are huge.
And make them what Douglas North calls perennial institutions, ones which go on beyond the individual.
Ones that have
real
life
institutions.
beyond Lamido Sanusi,
Yeah.
the central bank governor, for
Yeah.
example. Absolutely, because at the moment, I would argue Nigeria really doesn't have any meaningful institutions.
Right. Okay, Buhari, institutions. Great. Ramani, what's your
Well, I
reference?
mean, since you picked a political stakeholder, let me pick a business or industry stakeholder, and I would pick the CEO of Apple. I think as the largest and the richest company in the world, and one that has probably infiltrated on every single continent, certainly, probably every region in every country in the world. I think I come back to Phil's point about in the 21st century, people talk about society, and so what is, as a company that wields so much of influence, both in terms of its supply chain, but also in terms of its product, what its contribution would be to society over and beyond simply saying, we're giving you access to technology by buying our very expensive products.
So Apple get beyond innovation and style and get
Yes.
into social. Okay, Juliet.
So I'm going to manage your expectations down a bit and go with President Jim Kim of the World Bank Group, because I think that they have a really key role to play in influencing development finance institutions to think about how they get beyond environmental social governance and think much more about conflict sensitivity and peace building, and try and take that group of actors with them.
So one from a government, one from a corporate giant, one from an international financial institution. Who did you choose?
I don't know the name of the person, but I'm going to choose someone who's already minded to do the right thing, who's heading a large insurance or extractive natural resources industry. Why? Because I think if you look around at our institutions, the ones that are actually incentivized to think beyond the 5-year electoral cycle or the 1-year household budget cycle are actually natural resources institutions or insurance companies or other sort of long-term financial investment companies. They're the only ones we actually ask to think beyond 5 years from now. As voters, we do not ask our politicians to think beyond 5 years from now. And certainly in fragile states, that's not the case. So I would pick the most enlightened of those. What would I say to her, or perhaps it's a him, would be you've really got to get the idea of peace into your understanding of what the social value that your company is creating is about, and I and some colleagues can help you to understand that. I also have a report for you. But don't be misled by the idea that there's a framework in the report. That's just to get there so you can look at the ideas in one pattern and one diagram. We're not intending that to be the way you should go forward.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you all, everybody. And you are now welcome to join and mingle and chat over some refreshments. But first, can we thank all four of the panelists, Juliet, Phil, Lanre, and I think it's been a really great conversation. All you have to do now is stand up, turn around, and you'll see where you have to go.